In the morning of the 24th February 2022, the Russian army, which had camped across Ukrainian border for months, launched a large-scale special military operation in Ukraine with the broad aim of protecting the people of the Donbas region, who claimed that the Ukrainian government had been harassing them. It was the biggest war in Europe after the Second World War, with the most shocking part being that the opponents, Russia and Ukraine, were former allies in the Soviet Union, and that the countries share a large proportion of history, culture and cooperation, which count centuries prior to Soviet Union collapse in 1990. Today counts more than 2 months after the start of this operation, which saw a number of citizens displaced while others fled to neighboring countries. In an exclusive interview with Igihe, the ambassador of Russian Federation to Rwanda, Karen Chalian, provides insights on the circumstances under which the operation was launched.
Well, you know, I've been in this business since the middle of 1977, and even I and my colleagues were in difficulties to understand what the Ukrainian regime since 2014 has been up to. Why I mentioned 2014? Because in February 2014, there was a completely unlawful, illegitimate anti-government coup in Ukraine, which brought to power the very political forces that have now precipitated an armed conflict. Paradoxically, this is not about Ukraine, not just about Ukraine. This is about an effort, or I should say the effort, by the collective West, which I believe is led by the United States, aided and abetted by the UK, to fight Russia politically and militarily again to the last Ukrainian. In this situation, the Ukrainians, in philosophical terms, are not a subject, they are an object. Whatever word you choose, instrument, tool, proxy, any term would fit. And I am amazed at how a leadership, a responsible leadership of a nation of 43 to 45 million people had not only allowed itself to be inveigled into such a scheme, but also had decided for all practical purposes to involve its own people, the whole nation, in political and ideological war against its own brothers. And we are brothers. I sincerely believe that we are one people. You know, interestingly, it's difficult to give you an exact figure, but at least, and I'm old enough, to know, at least 30% of the people that I know in Russia have Ukrainian relatives. And it is the same in Ukraine. So what those people in Kiev did when they came to power was to move their own country onto a path of, for all practical purposes, civil war. First of all, civil war against their own citizens, and I will come to that, and civil war against their own brothers. And that's us. Now, when they came to power in February 2014, or rather when they were brought to power by the West And honestly, the West doesn't care. They don't care. They don't care how many Ukrainians get killed. And it's even worse when it comes to Russians. They're extremely happy. The more Russians die, the happier they are. In fact, it's now out in the open, especially in the past 72 hours, all the things that are being said, that there are two objectives that the West has in this war. First of all, to kill as many Russians as humanly possible, and second, to weaken Russia as much as possible. Thank you very much, as if we didn't know all along what the objective was. It's just that this grand secret is now in the open. It was never a secret to us. We always knew. This is a continuation of the Cold War by other means. It all started, it's interesting, people have cutoff points, people have starting points. All of us in our minds. We've tried to find that exact day, that statement, that trigger point. When did it all start? We can go back in history, which maybe we don't have time for this. But to me, it started in 2007, when, during the Munich Security Conference, my president went up on the podium and told all the Western leaders, we know what you're doing. Look, the Soviet Union is no more. The Warsaw Pact is no more. What do you need NATO for? Who is your so-called defensive alliance against? Who is it aimed at? There were 5 ways of NATO expansion. And every time they got closer and closer and closer to our borders. And my president gave the West a very fair warning in 2007, saying, please, cease and desist. We are ready to work with you, but we will not tolerate a security threat to our very existence. They chose not to listen. Because in 2008, in Bucharest, the capital of Romania, NATO decided that the next 2 candidates for NATO enlargement would be Ukraine and Georgia, 2 former republics of the Soviet Union. Now, I repeat, Ukraine is a country of 43 to 45 million people. No one knows exactly what we're talking about. We're not talking about the Baltic states here, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. I don't know if you know, I don't know if many people know, if anyone in the audience, that Ukraine possesses the 3rd largest army in Europe. The first army is Russian, the second one is Turkish, the third is Ukraine. And that is, let me preempt a question you might ask later about how we are often asked, why is this taking you so long? That's why. It's the 3rd largest army in Europe, deeply entrenched. For 8 years they had been preparing. Since the February 2014 coup, they've been preparing for this eventuality. They've been preparing for war. I'll come to that slightly later. So, 2008, NATO decides they're going to accept Ukraine. Now, what would a responsible government do under these circumstances? Any government. It would start thinking how to take proper precautions. Yes. Because, and I will need to come to this again and again and again, we can tolerate many things in life, both as individuals and as structures and as countries. But one thing none of us should ever tolerate is the existence and the creation of an existential threat from the outside to our security. And I have to underline the word existential. We're not talking about a common garden variety threat. Threats are many. They're minor, they're operational, they're tactical, but strategic, existential. No responsible government would ever allow that to happen. It will take measures. If necessary, it will undertake what is known in the United Nations and in international affairs as preventive deployment. And in fact, what my country has done is it has undertaken action under the provisions of Article 51 on individual and collective self-defense of Chapter 7 of the Charter of the United Nations. And you know what? When we're being told that you shouldn't have worried, you know, this is just talk. No one would have accepted Ukraine. I'm sorry. Responsible governments take decisions based not on the spoken, expressed good intentions of a particular group of people, but only based on their capabilities, on the capabilities that they possess. Because they're good today, they may be bad tomorrow, but the capabilities will remain. So we're all human, and we're all under political and ideological pressures, and Ukraine more than anyone else that I know, because for such a large nation to lose political sovereignty is, to me, it's just unbelievable. I cannot believe this has happened. That they are essentially governed from abroad. And, you know, there's a standing joke these days about my own colleagues when our people were saying, you know, in the past week that if the Ukrainian regime does certain things, then we will attack their decision-making centers. And my colleagues ask each other, decision-making, what has this got to do with Kiev? There's no point in attacking them. They don't decide anything.
Since the launch of the special military operation, Western countries have termed it as a war, an unnecessary invasion to conquer Ukraine, and so on. But why does Russia call it a special military operation?
We didn't mobilize. Russia is not in a state of mobilization. Our economy, our whole social life has not been militarized. To us, this is not a war. There's slightly over 100,000 military personnel that have gone into Ukraine. That's an expeditionary force. The other side, and you know, like military strategy means you have to have at least a 3-to-1 advantage over the defending side. The Ukrainian army, as far as I know, and we're talking about three main elements of the Ukrainian military. That is the regular army, the territorial battalions, and the National Guard. Roughly speaking, that's about 300,000. They're all fighting. And I think they possess another 200,000 in reserves. That's a formidable figure. And yet, we're still winning. This was never supposed to be some kind of lightning operation. You know, look at all the recent examples of a military conflict. Where was the last time you saw a lightning operation? I don't want to talk about what happened in Iraq, for example. I mean, You can look it up in Wikipedia, and you will see how much time it took one of the sides to move to the capital of the other side against no military opposition and with complete superiority in terms of armor and in the air. So just move to that place, and then how much time it took them in the capital to secure it. So I don't want to make these comparisons, but one of the other reasons, and I have to go back to what I've said, one of the other reasons why I said that had elements of civil war, genocide, and ethnocide. Because after the February 2014 coup in Kiev, the people who came to power were to us real Nazis, meaning National Socialists. Meaning they started eliminating and moving against anything and everything that had any connection to Russia or the Russian language. Now, two areas in the east, the Donbass and the Luhansk, which, by the way, have a special history. They were never part of the Ukraine until 1919. They said, look, guys, we don't wish to be governed by you. We don't like you. Please leave us alone. Let's come to an arrangement that we become a self-governing territory, or in this case, two territories. This was so easy. You know, when I look back at these 8 years, I see such a large number of missed opportunities to avoid military conflict. And it was, all these opportunities were missed by the Kiev regime. They didn't have to do much. They just needed to tell the people of Donetsk and Luhansk, okay, we respect your choice. Let us sit down and reach some kind of understanding of the limits or of the scope of the self-governance that you can hope to achieve. We reach a kind of a modus vivendi, and everyone's happy, and we continue living like brothers. Instead of that, they started killing them. And they've been killing them for 8 years with impunity. And no one in the West seemed to care. No one seemed to care. 8 years. Now, and in these 8 years, the Ukrainian armed forces were receiving training and equipment from the West. And they were getting stronger and stronger and stronger and more aggressive. In fact, the bombing campaign or the artillery campaign on 18 February was something like 10 to 15 times more intense than ordinarily by 18 February. It peaked on 21 February. And on 24 February, as you know, we moved in because we knew this was the end then. This was the end. They would have crushed them, they would have killed them. I've been killing civilians for 8 years. What's another 10, 20, 50, 100,000 civilians to those people? They are gripped by a very strange mania which I find hard to understand. But even harder than that, for me, is to understand what all those supposedly enlightened leaders in the West were thinking and are thinking still. Didn't they see what kind of monster they had created? The answer, of course, is evident. They saw everything. They created that monster. It was intent. It was not an accident. Because that monster was created to attack Russia and anything Russian. That monster was supposed to be a NATO bulwark, a NATO military base on our borders, and I repeat, a permanent existential threat to the security of my own country. We were not ready to tolerate NATO missiles within 5 minutes flying distance of Moscow. Sorry, that's where we take action. If you don't listen, we act. It is that simple. This is not higher mathematical calculus. And we keep telling them this since 2007. Stop, do not move your military alliance closer to our borders. We can be friends, partners, we can reach all kinds of understanding. But do not behave like you have won the Cold War and you want to solidify your victory. And you want to make sure that the Russian bear is dead for all time. That will never happen. When we went to Ukraine, this was not for territorial gain. God knows we have a large enough country. This was to achieve 4 goals. Denazification, because we could not live with those crazy people in power in Kiev. We needed to get them out. Demilitarization, meaning that we have to make sure that they will no longer constitute a threat, which means a legal obligation that they will not join NATO. The recognition of Crimea as a part of the Russian Federation, and the recognition of independence of the Donetsk and Luhansk republics. We had tried to put that on the table repeatedly. They said no repeatedly to everything, because they always felt that the West was behind them, and that the West will step in and fight for them when the time comes. Nice work, guys. That will never happen. The West will provide you with weapons. The West will provide you with money. No one's going to fight for you. The West doesn't want casualties and doesn't want a hot war with Russia. They want the Ukrainians to do their dirty work for them. Now, so this is not a war of territorial conquest. We want certain limited goals. But the longer this continues, the more the situation may change. Because expectations would have been created. And it's been shown in the history of the world that the more a conflict drags on and persists, the more the initial goals and objectives may change. I mean, once the situation on the ground changes, you never know. If the West continues to pump Ukraine full of weapons, and if the West does something else or something particularly stupid, I don't know what may happen in the Ukraine. I don't anticipate much, but I don't know. I don't anticipate much wisdom from the West. This is the problem. They've become fanatical. It's a group of fanatics, to me, as an individual and as a political scientist and as a historian, as a group of fanatics sitting in Western capitals, thinking about how to do damage to Russia. Regardless of Ukrainian casualties or of the ensuing destruction. All those videos that you have seen of destroyed settlements in the Ukraine, destroyed urban areas. I mean, we all see the same videos, right? What you don't see, what I see, but what you don't see, because we're watching different sources, is how Ukrainian armor and artillery has been deployed in the middle of these urban settlements. They hit us, we hit them, we hit civilians. It's a classic. It is a classic. I saw this when I was a peacekeeper. I saw this so many times. I saw this in the former Yugoslavia. I saw this during the siege of Sarajevo. If you have a multiple rocket launcher, a Grad, a BM-21 or something like this, based right next to a hospital. By the way, all of these hospitals, when you see destroyed schools and kindergartens, and they invite you to cry with them, you have to understand that there are no children in those schools or kindergartens, haven't been for several months now. Because these facilities have large assembly areas. They are now military barracks. A kindergarten is not a kindergarten without children and with soldiers. It's a legitimate military target. Same as a school, same as a hospital. You throw out the patients and medical personnel, you put in a mechanized company, it will get hit, especially if it does its fighting and deployment from that facility. The history of warfare has not invented anything new, just for our sake. So it's a terrible thing. Urban warfare is a terrible thing, which is, by the way, precluding a possible question from your side, why we left the north of Ukraine. Kiev, Chernigov, Sumy. We went in, then we left because the civilian casualties, two main reasons. The civilian casualties were getting too great because these are urban built-up areas. They were getting too great. And second, we wanted to show goodwill. Because we're negotiating at the same time. First, we negotiated in Minsk. Now we're negotiating in Turkey. Let's hope that something comes out of it. I hope so.
So you want to mean it is not a failure for the government to live with Kiev?
No. Look, given enough, I return to the military aspect of this. This is an expeditionary force. If we mobilize, I can give you another quote from the Bible. The living shall envy the dead. But we haven't. Why should we fight in urban areas?
Despite the call for negotiations, it remains challenging to predict when this conflict will come to an end. Here today, we ask the Russian ambassador to Rwanda about his country's stand in this situation.
This is the operation in southeast Ukraine, which is already underway. The sealing off of the western part of the Donbas cauldron. And once that happens, I do not believe that the Ukrainian armed forces would be able to relieve that area anymore, to relieve their troops, anymore that they were able to relieve the garrison of Mariupol. We knew from the very beginning, once that city was encircled, that was the end. We knew they would end up fighting in that iron and steel plant, which is impossible to take, and I use the word take loosely because it's a city. You can imagine, this was the largest iron and steel plant in Ukraine. and you have a city on the surface, and you have another city, another town down there. There are bunkers for 4,000 people. These were bunkers constructed in the days of the Soviet Union to withstand a Western nuclear strike. So they can sit there forever, at least until they run out of water, food, and ammunition. The interesting part is that they keep saying they have at least 1,000 civilians there. We've been saying for weeks, we are ready to help you remove every single civilian from that place through humanitarian corridors. They don't want to do that because the civilians are the greatest trump card that they have.
Because you cannot shoot them.
They protect them. It's a human shield. It's a human shield situation. We keep reaching agreement on humanitarian corridors, raising these flags, as indication that free passage is here, it's waiting, the buses are ready. It's not working. But as another interesting dimension of the situation in the iron and steel plant, we have 2,000 military personnel there, we believe, and there's some indication that there's about 400 foreign fighters there. And that may be one of the reasons they're not giving up. If those foreign fighters surrender, the term foreign fighter is very loose. Who are these people? Are they volunteers?
I was going to ask.
Are they volunteers? Are they mercenaries? Are they instructors? And that's the most interesting category. They've undertaken in the past weeks at least 3 attempts, 3 very brave attempts, to bring in helicopters from the Azov Sea, from the shore side, into that plant to evacuate whom? People were risking their lives. We took down 3 helicopters. People were risking their lives, some very brave pilots, acting on desperate orders to land there and evacuate certain people.
Who are they?
Your guess would be as good as mine. But those attempts were suicidal. They were suicidal, and you can't evacuate 2,000 people by means of a few helicopters. That means the objective was to bring out a number of extremely valuable individuals. I believe we shot down 3 helicopters, and one managed to get away. There you go. Let me tell you, I don't know if you've heard about a place in Kosovo called Račak. Have you ever heard that about? All those who worked in the former Yugoslavia immediately make that connection. In 1999, at the beginning of 99, Serbian special forces went into the village of Račak in Kosovo. And I was in Belgrade at that point. And they went in because they knew that a unit of the Kosovo Liberation Army had went in for the night. They went in, they killed everybody, and 2 hours later, it was still night, they left. Which, as it turns out, was not a very good idea. Because the next day, that village was, well, it wasn't retaken because the There was still no, there was still no foreign troops on the ground. But the Albanians went in, the OSCE mission went in, the bodies were redressed. I know some people who worked with those bodies. When the bullet holes in the bodies and the bullet holes in the clothes did not even correspond, there were some cases like that. They brought in fresh bodies. They dumped all the bodies from all the houses into one ditch. And then the cameras went in, the same CNN. Massacre. The Serbs massacred innocent civilians. And that was a trigger event for a NATO bombing, of course, of Serbia. What happened in Bucha? We left on 30 March. Our troops withdrew on 30 March. The Ukrainians came back the next day. Our Ukrainian administration that had ran away. The mayor of Bucha on 31 March was shown giving an interview in those same streets. Nothing was said for 3 days. On the fourth day, you had bodies scattered around the streets in interesting poses. Fresh corpses. We couldn't have killed those people. Fresh corpses. With blood still in the wounds. With no rigidity. 8 days later, Ursula von der Leyen comes to visit. This was so incongruous. And Josep Borrell from the European Union. And there's a wonderful photo. You know, I know these things because I was involved in these things. You have black body bags, and there's an Orthodox priest with a beard and a huge cross, looking solemn, and Ursula von der Leyen and Borrell looking very serious, saying this is a terrible crime. These corpses have been on the streets for 8 days. Are you kidding me? And no one has a mortuary mask on him. You know what the smell is like? This was staged, all of this. And to any unbiased observer, I mean the logic, you add 2 and 2. First of all, why did these corpses appear on the fourth day? Where were they before? Why are body bags? Why were the bodies lying on the streets for days? What, they have no friends and relatives? People there are no animals. They would have buried their people. And 8 days later, they're still in body bags on the streets? Who are you trying to fool here? You know, as Joseph Stalin used to say, gentlemen, this is a story either for little children or very big fools.
Всім добрий вечір. Лідер фракції тут, голова Офісу президента тут, прем'єр-міністр Шмигаль тут, Подоляк тут, президент тут. Всі ми тут, наші військові.
Oh, guys,
Громадяни суспільства.
removing Zelensky for what? Who is Zelensky? And you know, Marxist theory, and I studied Marxist theory when I was much younger. There is this fascinating premise about the role of an individual in history. According to Marxian theory, an individual is maybe not nothing, but compared to the action, development of historical forces, he is not something that is a fact of great significance. If you look at Zelensky, the individual, you know, we all loved Zelensky as a comedian. That guy was great. We still watch videos with him on YouTube. The man was a Russian speaker. he always used to poke fun at the Ukrainian nationalists and Nazis to the point where he was receiving death threats from them. He was always their enemy. And he was loved in Russia. Suddenly, after all these traditional leaders in the Ukraine failed, he is identified by someone. He is plucked out of this artistic and cultural milieu. And suddenly he's a political leader, which was amazing to everybody. I mean, wait a minute, how did this happen? He does not have a party. He does not have a political force behind him. He has no ideology. He has no politics. I mean, where did he come from? We used to say these things of Macron, if you recall. But, you know, this was bizarre, what happened in Kiev. And then he wins this election because people were so tired of those traditional leaders, of the thieves, all those corrupt individuals, and, you know, they were all known through and through. And this was this fresh face, out of nowhere. And he was pro-Russian. He was a Russian speaker. I've never heard him speak a word of Ukrainian up until now. And naturally, the people who would vote for him enthusiastically, because he was the only remaining option. Someone, anyone except the old guard. Anyone. So if he leaves tomorrow, you know, he's not in control of events. He is surrounded by several dozen very hard men from the military and security services, both Ukrainian and Western, who are in full control of what he does in all Ukrainian policies. But as a figurehead, he's still very good. That short, heroic figure in a military-style t-shirt, unshaven, looking gaunt and pale. He looks good. Don't forget, he's an artist. He's an actor. He knows how to do these things. He knows how to speak. He knows where to make all the proper pauses in his sentences. But the real people are behind the surface and behind his back and in other European capitals. Not to mention the ones who are across the Atlantic.
We will limit Russia's ability to do business in dollars, euros, pounds, and yen.
I'm not going to claim to you that this is not unpleasant. It's unpleasant, it's uncomfortable. And a few months from now, I will be able to give you a more definite assessment of how this really, this is all very fresh still. But what constantly amazes me is this never-ending misreading of the Russian psyche by people in the West who should know better. When I read and I listen to all these statements by people who are described as Russia analysts, and you look at their educational qualifications, goodness, a couple of bachelors, a couple of masters, a PhD, speaks Russian, and you think, he's an expert. He's not an expert, he's a clown. He's a clown. I am amazed at the obtuseness and lack of understanding of how Russians react. You put pressure on Russians, they're not going to rebel against the government. They're not going to pour out into the streets and demand the return of McDonald's. They will support the government even more, which is what I told you. The support is actually growing. People are angry. People are also angry because the West is taking them for idiots. The West believes that the Russians are not able anymore to fly to Milan for the annual fashion show or buy diamonds in Amsterdam. They will overthrow the government. How stupid can you get? This simply will not happen. The mood is getting more and more resolute. You're trying to pressure us. You're trying to coerce us. Ain't gonna work. We are going to push on, and we're going to finish what we started. It's very simple. But again, what scares me is the lack of mental, intellectual, and analytical quality in the West among people who should know better. Russians never give in to coercion. It's not in our psyche. And when I say psyche, I don't mean brain. I mean here, in the gut. Where all the proper and honest human emotions come from. You know what the main problem is? The West is forcing countries to choose sides. The pressures are enormous, and they never come from Russia. If only, and for two reasons. First, we have nothing to threaten Africa with. And the second reason is we simply don't operate that way. We don't go where we're not wanted. We do not issue instructions to governments and countries how they should behave. We don't tell them how they should vote. We can recommend something. The West operates completely differently. There was a wonderfully ironic expression in Russian back in the days of my youth. It had something to do with the political course of the Soviet Union. It was like this, but it was internal. If you do not sing with us, do not forget that you're being silent against us. That means forget about voting with Russia. That's not even the issue here. They do not allow anyone to even be neutral. They always want you to pick a side, their side. Neutrality, not just supporting Russia, I mean, that's risky business. Neutrality is, as far as the West is concerned, neutrality is not an option. You have to be with them publicly. Publicly, officially, openly, emotionally, whatever. This is the problem. They don't allow you to keep your own conscience. How do you get out of this?
Yes.
As always in life, look, it's the usual. The stronger you are, the more freedom you possess. The stronger you are, the richer you are, the more freedom you have in your actions. It's that simple. Humanity has not invented any other way for the past 5,000 years.